I never thought I'd be standing in line at a homeless shelter in downtown Seattle, my arms wrapped around myself against the November drizzle that seemed to seep into every fiber of my being. The sky was that particular shade of gunmetal gray that I'd grown up with, the kind that hung low over the Space Needle and made the surrounding buildings look like they were drowning in mist. My sneakers were soaked through, my jeans splattered with mud from the puddles I'd trudged through on 3rd Avenue, and my hair hung in wet strands across my face. I was 28 years old. I had a college degree in graphic design from the University of Washington, and I was homeless. 3 months ago, my life had looked completely different. Back then, I'd been living in a modest studio apartment in Capitol Hill. Nothing fancy, but it was mine, with large windows that caught the afternoon light, and a view of the street below where coffee shops and vintage stores lined the sidewalk. I'd been working freelance, building my portfolio, and I'd managed to save almost $12,000 over 2 years of careful budgeting and sacrifice. Every dollar had been accounted for, every expense tracked in the little green notebook I kept on my kitchen counter. That money represented my future, my security, my ticket to maybe starting my own design studio someday. I'd skipped vacations, worn the same winter coat for 5 years, made my coffee at home instead of buying it at the dozens of cafes that surrounded me. My best friend Melissa had always teased me about being too careful with money, too paranoid about the future. She'd grown up differently than I had, with parents who owned a successful software company in Bellevue, who'd paid for her education and her car and her downtown condo. She'd never had to worry about where her next meal was coming from, or whether she could afford her rent. Melissa and I had been friends since freshman year at UW, thrown together as roommates in McCarty Hall and somehow clicking despite our vastly different backgrounds. She was spontaneous, where I was cautious, extravagant, where I was frugal, but she was also funny and loyal, and had been there for me through my worst breakup and the death of my grandmother. When she'd asked me to add her to my savings account 6 months ago, she'd had what seemed like a reasonable explanation. Her name wasn't on any of her parents' accounts anymore after a fight they'd had about her spending habits, and she needed somewhere to deposit some checks from freelance photography work she was doing. She promised she wouldn't touch my money. She just needed a temporary place to park her own funds until she got things sorted with her bank. I'd hesitated, my instincts screaming at me that this was a bad idea, but she'd looked at me with those green eyes that could convince anyone of anything, and I'd given in. What we're friends for, right? For a few months, everything seemed fine. I'd check my account online and see my balance holding steady, slowly growing as I added my own deposits. Melissa would occasionally mention that she'd deposited something or withdrawn her own money, but I never looked that closely at the individual transactions. I trusted her. That was my first mistake. My second mistake was not checking my account more carefully when I noticed my debit card was declined at the grocery store one afternoon in early September. I'd assumed it was just a glitch, maybe my bank's fraud detection system being overzealous. I'd used cash instead, and made a mental note to call them later. But life got busy. I had a big project deadline for a client who ran a chain of coffee roasters in Portland, and I forgot about it. It wasn't until I received an overdraft notice in the mail 2 weeks later that I actually logged into my account and felt my entire world collapse beneath me. My balance read negative $347. I stared at the screen of my laptop, sitting at the small desk by my window, convinced this had to be some kind of error. I scrolled through my transaction history, and that's when I saw them. Dozens of withdrawals and transfers, all initiated over the past month, totaling nearly $12,500. My entire savings, gone. Every single transaction was authorized with the account access I'd given Melissa. My hands started shaking so badly I could barely control the mouse. I called her immediately, my voice cracking as I asked her what had happened, whether her account had been hacked, whether someone had stolen her information. The silence on the other end of the line lasted too long. Then she said, in a voice that was too casual, too detached, that she'd had some unexpected expenses come up and she'd borrowed some money from the account. Borrowed. As if my life savings was a cup of sugar she'd scooped from a neighbor's pantry. I asked her how much, even though I was staring right at the numbers on my screen. She hesitated again and said she wasn't sure exactly, maybe a few thousand, but she'd pay me back as soon as her parents transferred her some money. They'd been fighting again, she explained, and had temporarily cut her off, but it would all be sorted soon. I asked her why she hadn't asked me first, why she'd just taken it without even a text message or a phone call. She got defensive then, her voice taking on that edge it got when she felt cornered, saying that I was being dramatic, that friends helped each other out, that she'd helped me plenty of times, and I was acting like she'd committed some terrible crime. I told her she'd taken $12,000. She went quiet again. Then she said that couldn't be right, that I must be looking at it wrong, that she'd only made a few withdrawals. I read her the dates and amounts, my voice getting louder with each one. $1,000 on September 3rd, $2,000 on September 8th, $1,500 on September 12th, on and on, transaction after transaction, all while I'd been busy working and living my life, and trusting that my friend wasn't systematically draining every penny I'd worked so hard to save. She started crying then, saying she was sorry, that things had gotten out of control, that she'd been planning to put it all back before I noticed. She'd gotten involved with a guy named Derek, who'd convinced her to invest in some cryptocurrency opportunity that was supposed to triple her money in a month, and she'd used my savings as the investment capital, because she was so sure she'd be able to return it with profit before I ever knew it was gone. I felt like I was going to vomit. I asked her if she was telling me she'd gambled away my entire life savings on some crypto scam. She insisted it wasn't a scam, that Derek knew what he was doing, that the money was just temporarily tied up, and she'd get it back soon. I asked her where this Derek was, how I could contact him, whether she had any documentation of this investment. She became evasive, said Derek had gone to California for a few weeks to meet with some investors, that he'd be back soon and would sort everything out. The way she said it, with that tremor in her voice, I knew even she didn't believe it anymore. She'd been conned, and she'd used my money to fund her own gullibility. I told her she had 1 week to return my money, or I'd go to the police. She started begging then, pleading with me not to involve the authorities, saying it would ruin her life, that her parents would disown her, that she'd figure something out. I hung up on her. I spent the next 3 hours sitting at my desk, staring out at the street below as the September afternoon faded into evening, trying to process what had just happened. $12,000, gone. 2 years of sacrifice and discipline and careful planning evaporated because I'd been stupid enough to trust someone who'd proven over and over again that she had no concept of the value of money or the weight of responsibility. The next week was a blur of phone calls and desperate attempts to salvage the situation. I called my bank and explained what had happened, but because I'd authorized Melissa's access to the account, they told me there was nothing they could do from their end. I'd have to pursue it as a civil matter or file a police report for theft. I called Melissa every day, each conversation more desperate than the last. She kept promising she was working on it, that she was trying to track Derek down, that her parents were considering helping, but she needed more time to explain the situation to them. By the end of the week, she'd stopped answering my calls altogether. Her voicemail box was full. Her social media accounts had gone silent. I did go to the police. I spent 4 hours at the precinct on East Pike Street, sitting in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights, giving my statement to an officer who looked barely old enough to have graduated from the academy. He was sympathetic, but not optimistic. He explained that because I'd voluntarily given her access to the account, it would be difficult to prove theft. It would likely be classified as a civil dispute, which meant I'd need to sue her in court to try to recover the money. That would take months, possibly years, and there was no guarantee I'd win, or that she'd have any money to give me even if I did win. He took down all the information, filed a report, and told me someone would be in touch. No one ever was. Without my savings to fall back on, the dominoes started falling fast. My biggest client, the Portland Coffee Roaster, decided to go with a larger design firm for their rebrand project. Another client delayed payment on an invoice by 6 weeks, citing budget issues. My landlord increased my rent by $200 a month, which was legal since I was month to month, but which I suddenly couldn't afford. I started applying for full-time positions, any positions, but the Seattle design market was saturated, and most places wanted 3 to 5 years of agency experience that I didn't have. I burned through my credit cards buying groceries and paying utilities, thinking I'd catch up once I landed a new client or got hired somewhere. But October came and went with nothing but rejection emails and ghosted applications. By early November, I was 2 months behind on rent. My landlord was understanding at first, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, who owned the building and lived on the ground floor, but her sympathy had limits. She had a mortgage to pay, she explained, standing in my doorway with an eviction notice in her hand. She was giving me until the end of the month to pay what I owed or vacate the apartment. I had $800 left across all my accounts and credit cards, and I owed her $3,000. I asked if I could work out a payment plan. She said she'd tried that with tenants before, and it never worked out, that she'd learned her lesson. I had 3 weeks to figure something out. I called my father. I hadn't spoken to him in almost 6 months, not since our last uncomfortable phone call, where he'd asked me for money, and I'd had to say no. My parents had divorced when I was 11, and my father had moved to Tacoma, about 40 minutes south, where he'd bounced between jobs and relationships for years. He'd struggled with alcohol when I was growing up, though he'd been sober for the past 5 years, according to my younger brother Jake. We had a complicated relationship, full of old resentments and unspoken disappointments, but he was still my father, and I was desperate. The phone rang 6 times before he answered, his voice groggy like I'd woken him, even though it was 2 p.m. I explained my situation, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to sound as pathetic as I felt. There was a long silence when I finished. Then he said he didn't have that kind of money, that he was barely making ends meet himself, working at a warehouse loading dock and living in a studio apartment smaller than mine. I asked if he could loan me even $1,000, just enough to buy me more time. He sighed, and I could hear him lighting a cigarette, the scratch of the lighter coming through clearly. He said he was sorry, that if he had it, he'd give it to me, but he was telling me the truth. He couldn't help. I tried to keep the desperation out of my voice as I thanked him and said I understood. Before I could hang up, he asked if I'd tried calling my mother. I almost laughed. My mother had remarried 7 years ago to a dentist named Richard, and they'd moved to Arizona, where she'd made it very clear she was starting a new chapter of her life. She sent perfunctory birthday cards and the occasional Facebook message, but we weren't close. She'd made her choice about which parts of her old life she wanted to maintain, and apparently, I wasn't high on that list. I told my father I'd figure something out and ended the call. I sat on my bed, in the apartment I was about to lose, and cried until I had no tears left. The eviction was carried out on November 27th, 3 days before Thanksgiving. Patricia was apologetic, but firm as the sheriff's deputy supervised, while I packed what I could fit into 2 suitcases and 4 boxes. Everything else, all my furniture, my dishes, my books, the framed pictures on my walls, all of it had to stay, because I had nowhere to take it. Patricia said she'd store it for 30 days in case I got back on my feet, but we both knew that was unlikely. I loaded my boxes into my 10-year-old Honda Civic, the one thing I owned outright, and drove away from Capitol Hill with no idea where I was going. I spent that night in my car, parked in a lot near Green Lake, watching joggers and dog walkers circle the water as the temperature dropped, and my breath fogged the windows. I'd never felt more alone in my entire life. I tried staying with an acquaintance from college for a few days, sleeping on her couch in Fremont, but her roommate complained, and I could feel myself overstaying my welcome. I tried a hostel for a week, draining the last of my available credit, but even cheap hostels in Seattle aren't that cheap, and I couldn't sustain it. I applied for assistance, for housing programs, for emergency funds, but the waiting lists were months long, and the bureaucracy was overwhelming. Every office I visited had the same story. Not enough resources, too many people in need, come back next week, and maybe we'll know more. The reality of homelessness in Seattle is that unless you're a woman with children, you're not a priority for the limited shelter space available. Single adults, even single adult women, fall into this gray area where help is theoretical, but beds are scarce. That's how I ended up in line at the shelter on a cold Tuesday afternoon in late November, standing behind 30 other people, all of us hoping there would be space for the night. The shelter was in a converted church building in Pioneer Square, all brick and narrow windows, with the smell of industrial cleaner and too many bodies in too small a space emanating from the open door. The people around me in line were a cross-section of human struggle. Older men with weathered faces and missing teeth, younger guys who looked like they'd aged a decade in a year, a few women like me trying to maintain some semblance of dignity despite our circumstances. We didn't talk much to each other. There's a particular shame that comes with needing a shelter, a feeling that you've failed at something fundamental, and making eye contact with others who share that failure feels like acknowledging it out loud. I'd been standing there for maybe 20 minutes, my feet numb in my wet sneakers, my stomach empty because I'd been rationing the protein bars I'd bought 3 days ago, when I heard someone say my name. Not call it out exactly, but say it with that particular tone of disbelief and shock that makes you want to disappear into the ground. I looked up and saw my father standing on the sidewalk about 15 feet away, holding 2 plastic grocery bags and staring at me like he was seeing a ghost. He was wearing a green waterproof jacket I didn't recognize, and a Seahawks cap, his face more lined than I remembered, his beard grayer. For a moment, We just stared at each other, and I watched understanding dawn in his eyes as he took in the line I was standing in, the shelter behind me, the desperate circumstances that were suddenly, horribly clear. He walked toward me, and I wanted to run, to disappear, to be anywhere but there, having this moment with him. The shame that had been sitting in my chest for weeks suddenly intensified into something physical, something that made it hard to breathe. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes scanning my face, my wet clothes, my suitcase on the ground beside me. He asked me what I was doing here, and the question sounded accusatory, even though I don't think he meant it that way. I told him the truth, or a version of it, speaking fast and quiet because I didn't want the people around me to hear, even though they had their own problems and weren't paying attention. I told him about Melissa, about the money, about losing my apartment and my clients and everything falling apart so fast I couldn't catch it. My father's expression shifted through several emotions I couldn't quite read. Shock, anger, something that might have been guilt. He asked me why I hadn't called him again, why I hadn't told him it had gotten this bad. I reminded him that I had called him, that he'd said he couldn't help, and I wasn't about to beg. He winced at that, and I saw him make some kind of decision in real time, his jaw setting in a way that reminded me of when I was young and he'd decided to put his foot down about something. He picked up my suitcase before I could protest, told me I wasn't staying at any shelter, that I was coming home with him. I started to argue, started to say I'd be fine, but he cut me off with a look that didn't allow for discussion. He said we could talk about everything else later, but right now, tonight, I was coming with him. I followed him to his truck, an older Ford F-150 with a dent in the passenger door, and we drove south toward Tacoma in silence. The rain had picked up, drumming on the roof of the cab, and the highway was slick with water that reflected the red taillights of the cars ahead of us. I stared out the window, watching Seattle disappear behind us, feeling simultaneously grateful and humiliated. My father finally spoke when we were past the airport, asking me if I'd eaten today. I lied and said yes. He didn't believe me, and pulled into a Denny's off the highway, insisting we get food. We sat in a booth with cracked vinyl seats, under lights that were too bright, and I ate a burger and fries while my father drank coffee and watched me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. He told me his apartment was small, just one bedroom, but he had a couch I could sleep on for as long as I needed. He said he knew he hadn't been much of a father to me over the years, that he'd made a lot of mistakes, and hadn't been there when I needed him. But he was here now, and he wasn't going to let me sleep on the street or in some shelter. There was something in his voice, a determination mixed with regret, that made my throat tighten. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without crying. He asked about Melissa, about whether I'd reported her to the police, about whether there was any way to get the money back. I explained what the police had told me, how it was a civil matter, how she'd disappeared and wasn't responding to any attempts to contact her. My father's face darkened, and he said some choice words about people who betrayed their friends that would have made me laugh under different circumstances. His apartment in Tacoma was in a complex near the port, where you could hear the foghorns from the container ships and smell the salt water mixed with diesel. It was small and sparse, furnished with second-hand furniture and boxes that looked like they'd never been fully unpacked despite him living there for 2 years. But it was clean and warm, and the couch he'd mentioned was actually a pull-out bed that he insisted on setting up for me with sheets and a thick blanket. He showed me where everything was, gave me a towel so I could take a hot shower, and told me to help myself to anything in the fridge. The shower was one of the best things I'd experienced in weeks, standing under the hot water until the bathroom was thick with steam, washing away days of grime and shame. When I came out, my father had made tea and was sitting at his small kitchen table, the grocery bags from earlier unpacked. He'd bought basics: bread, peanut butter, eggs, some canned soup. Not much, but he'd clearly been shopping for himself on a tight budget, and now he was sharing what little he had. We sat there drinking tea, and he asked me to tell him everything from the beginning. So I did. I told him about trusting Melissa, about not checking my account carefully enough, about watching my life fall apart in slow motion and being powerless to stop it. I told him about applying for jobs and getting nowhere, about calling everyone I could think of for help and coming up empty, about the particular terror of not knowing where you're going to sleep at night. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I didn't expect. He said he understood what it felt like to lose everything, to feel like you'd failed at life, because he'd been there more times than he could count. He talked about his own struggles with alcohol, about losing jobs and relationships and self-respect, about the years when he'd been so deep in his addiction that he'd pushed away everyone who cared about him, including me and Jake. He said the last 5 years of sobriety had been about trying to rebuild, trying to become someone his kids could be proud of, even if he knew he could never make up for the years he'd been absent. His voice cracked a little when he said he was sorry he hadn't been able to help me when I'd called, that if he'd known how bad things really were, he would have figured something out, sold something, done whatever it took. I realized, sitting there in his cramped kitchen at almost midnight, that I'd never really known my father as an adult. I'd held on to this image of him from my childhood. Unreliable, absent, disappointing. But the man sitting across from me was trying, was sober, was working a hard job and living modestly, and doing his best with what he had. He wasn't perfect, and he couldn't fix my problems, but he was here, and that counted for something. I told him I appreciated him taking me in, that I knew it wasn't convenient, and I'd try to figure something out as quickly as possible. He waved that away and said I could stay as long as I needed, that we'd figure it out together. Living with my father was strange at first, an adjustment to sharing space with someone I barely knew anymore. He worked early shifts at the warehouse, leaving before dawn and coming home in the afternoon smelling like cardboard and diesel. He was quiet, and kept to himself mostly, but he'd ask about my day, about my job search, offering encouragement even when we both knew the prospects were bleak. I spent my days applying for positions, any positions, expanding my search beyond just design work to include administrative jobs, retail, food service, anything that would bring in income. The Seattle market was tough, but Tacoma had fewer opportunities and was just as competitive. My brother Jake came to visit about a week after I'd moved in, driving down from Everett where he worked as a mechanic. He was 3 years younger than me, and we'd always been close despite our parents' divorce and our father's struggles. He hugged me for a long time when he arrived, and I could tell Dad had filled him in on what had happened. Jake was furious about Melissa, said he'd always known there was something off about her, asked if I wanted him to track her down and scare her a little. I appreciated the solidarity but told him it wouldn't help. The money was gone, and no amount of confrontation would bring it back. Jake had brought groceries with him, enough to fill Dad's fridge and pantry, refusing to take no for an answer when Dad tried to insist it wasn't necessary. Watching my father and brother interact, seeing the relationship they'd managed to build during the years I'd kept my distance, made me realize how much I'd missed by holding on to my resentments. We spent that evening together, the three of us, eating Jake's famous chili and watching a Seahawks game on Dad's small TV. It felt almost normal, like maybe this was what family was supposed to be. People showing up for each other when things got hard, not keeping score of past mistakes, just being present. Dad asked Jake about work, and Jake complained about his boss, and made us laugh with stories about the ridiculous things customers expected him to fix on their cars. Jake asked me about my design work, wanted to see my portfolio, and spent 20 minutes telling me how talented I was, and how any company would be lucky to hire me. It was exactly what I needed to hear, even if it felt overly optimistic. As November turned into December, I started picking up small freelance projects again, tiny jobs on Fiverr and Upwork that paid barely anything but at least brought in some income. I designed logos for startups, created social media graphics for small businesses, anything someone would pay me to do. Dad refused to take any money from me for rent or food, saying I needed to save whatever I earned to get back on my feet, but I insisted on contributing something. We compromised. I'd buy groceries once a week and help with utilities. It wasn't much, but it was something, and it helped me feel less like a complete burden. The holidays were approaching, and I dreaded them. Thanksgiving had come and gone quietly, just the three of us eating a roasted chicken, because Dad's oven was too small for a turkey, watching the parade on TV and pretending everything was fine. But Christmas loomed larger, more weighted with expectations and memories of better years. Jake invited us both to celebrate with him and his girlfriend Emma at their apartment in Everett, and Dad seemed excited about it, more animated than I'd seen him. He asked me if I was okay with going, if it wouldn't be too hard given everything that had happened. I told him I'd be fine, that I was actually looking forward to it. I was still trying to track down Melissa, not because I thought I'd get my money back, but because I needed some kind of closure, some explanation that made sense of how someone I'd trusted could do this to me. I'd finally gotten a response to one of my many messages in early December, a short text that said she was staying with Derek's family in San Francisco, that she was sorry about everything, that the cryptocurrency thing had been a complete disaster and the money was gone. She said she'd try to pay me back eventually, but it would take time, maybe years. She asked me not to hate her. I didn't respond. What was there to say? The betrayal was complete. The friendship was over, and no amount of apologies would change what had happened. My father asked me one night, as we were both sitting in his living room, him reading a Tom Clancy novel, and me working on a logo design, what I'd learned from all this. It was a strange question, phrased like there was supposed to be some silver lining to losing everything. I thought about it for a while before answering. I told him I'd learned that trust was more complicated than I'd thought, that being careful wasn't the same as being smart, that good people could make terrible decisions that destroyed other people's lives. I said I'd learned that the safety net I'd thought existed, the systems and programs and help that was supposed to be there when you fell, was full of holes and bureaucracy and impossible requirements. I'd learned that homelessness could happen to anyone, that it wasn't about being lazy or making bad choices. It was about how fast everything could fall apart when you didn't have resources to fall back on. But I'd also learned, I told him, that family could surprise you, that people you'd written off could show up when you needed them, that my father, who I'd spent years resenting and keeping at arm's length, had been the one person who'd actually helped me when I had nowhere else to go. He looked up from his book at that, and I saw his eyes get a little wet. He said he was glad he could finally be there for me, that it meant more to him than I knew, that he'd spent years wishing he could make up for the past, and this had given him a chance to try. We didn't hug or have some big emotional moment. That wasn't really how either of us operated. But something shifted between us that night, some old wall coming down, some forgiveness I hadn't realized I'd been withholding finally being offered. Christmas at Jake's apartment was chaotic and warm, and exactly what I needed. Emma had gone all out with decorations, and had cooked enough food for 10 people even though there were only 4 of us. We exchanged modest gifts, things we'd made or found at thrift stores, nothing expensive because none of us had money to spare. Jake gave me a framed picture of the 2 of us from when we were kids, standing on the beach at Alki with Dad, all of us smiling and sandy and happy. I didn't remember the day the photo was taken, but looking at it made me remember that there had been good times, that our family hadn't always been broken. I gave Dad a sketch I'd done of the Tacoma waterfront, the view from his apartment building, rendered in the style of old maritime charts. He stared at it for a long moment, and said it was the best gift anyone had ever given him, which made me cry even though I hadn't meant to. In January, something shifted. I landed a contract position with a marketing agency in Seattle, a 3-month project managing their social media presence and creating content for their clients. It wasn't design work exactly, but it paid well, and it was in my field. The commute from Tacoma to Seattle was long, over an hour each way on good days, but I didn't care. I was working again, earning steady money, starting to rebuild. Dad was thrilled, more excited than I was, telling everyone at his warehouse that his daughter had gotten a job at a marketing agency in Seattle, making it sound more impressive than it was. Jake took me out to celebrate, and we sat at a dive bar in Everett, talking about how this was just the beginning, how I'd land something permanent soon, how everything was going to work out. The contract position led to other opportunities. One of the agency's clients was so impressed with my work that they hired me directly to redesign their entire brand identity. Another client recommended me to a friend who needed a website overhaul. Slowly, steadily, my freelance business started to rebuild. It wasn't the same as before. I was more careful now, more selective about clients, more insistent on contracts and deposits and clear terms. I'd learned my lesson about trust, about assuming people would do the right thing. Every dollar I earned went into a new savings account, one that only I had access to, one that I checked obsessively to make sure the balance was what it should be. By March, I had enough saved to start looking for my own place again. Dad insisted I didn't need to rush, that I could stay as long as I wanted, but we both knew it was time. I'd regained my footing, and as much as I'd grown to appreciate our time living together, I needed my independence back. I found a studio in Tacoma, not far from Dad's place, smaller than my old apartment in Capitol Hill, but affordable and clean and mine. Moving in felt like a victory, like I'd clawed my way back from the edge of something dark and scary. Dad and Jake helped me move the few boxes of belongings I'd retrieved from storage, plus the secondhand furniture I'd acquired. Dad kept checking to make sure I had everything I needed, offering to lend me things, clearly reluctant to see me go even though he'd never say it out loud. I never got my $12,000 back from Melissa. She did reach out once more in April, a long message full of apologies and explanations that didn't really explain anything. She said she'd left Derek, that she was living with her parents again, that she was seeing a therapist and trying to figure out how she'd made such terrible decisions. She asked if we could ever be friends again. I thought about it for a long time before responding. I told her I didn't hate her, that I hoped she got the help she needed, but that our friendship was over. Some betrayals couldn't be undone. Some trust couldn't be rebuilt. She'd made choices that had nearly destroyed my life, and forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or allowing her back into my world. She responded with a short message saying she understood, and I never heard from her again. The thing about hitting rock bottom is that it changes your perspective on everything. I used to worry constantly about the future, about whether I was saving enough, whether I was making the right career choices, whether I was doing enough. Now, I worried about different things, more immediate things, whether I had enough in my emergency fund, whether my clients were paying on time, whether the relationships I was building were with trustworthy people. But I also appreciated things I'd taken for granted before, having a warm, dry place to sleep, having food in my fridge, having family who showed up, having work that challenged and fulfilled me. These weren't small things. They were everything. My relationship with my father became one of the unexpected gifts from that terrible period. We talked on the phone regularly, met for dinner once a week, shared the mundane details of our lives. He told me stories about his years of sobriety, about the work he was doing to make amends, about his dreams of maybe retiring someday to a small place near the water where he could fish. I told him about my clients, about the projects I was excited about my slowly growing business. He was proud of me, and he said so often, making up for all the years when he hadn't been present to see what I was accomplishing. Jake noticed the change too, commented on how our little family had somehow become closer, more functional, more real. By summer, my freelance business was thriving enough that I could afford to move back to Seattle if I wanted to, but I found I didn't want to. Tacoma had grown on me, with its grittier waterfront and cheaper rent and slower pace. I liked being close to my father and my brother, liked the life I was building here. Capitol Hill and my old studio apartment seemed like a lifetime ago, a different person's life. I was different now, harder in some ways, but also more grounded, more aware of what mattered. I'd survived something I never thought I'd have to face, and it had stripped away a lot of illusions, but had also revealed truths about resilience and family, and the random cruelty of life that I couldn't have learned any other way. I did eventually track down that guy Derek who'd convinced Melissa to invest my money in his cryptocurrency scheme. It took months of internet sleuthing and following digital breadcrumbs, but I found him living in Austin, Texas, running another investment scam under a different name. I reported him to the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, with all the documentation I'd gathered. I don't know if anything came of it, but at least I tried. At least I did something to potentially stop him from ruining other people's lives the way he'd helped ruin mine. It felt like a tiny victory, a small piece of justice in a situation that had mostly been defined by injustice. Sometimes, late at night in my studio apartment, I thought about that day my father saw me standing in line at the shelter, how that moment of supreme humiliation had turned into a turning point, how the person I'd kept at arm's length for so many years had been the one to catch me when I fell. Life was strange that way, full of unexpected connections and second chances that appeared in the darkest moments. My father had his own regrets about the past, his own struggles and failures, but when it mattered most, he'd been there. He'd given me a place to land, and in doing so, he'd given us both a chance to rebuild our relationship from the ground up. I still kept that green notebook where I'd once tracked every dollar of my savings, though now it served a different purpose. Instead of just recording expenses and deposits, I used it to track the things I was grateful for, the small victories and moments of connection that made life worth living, despite its challenges. Having dinner with Dad and Jake, landing a new client, receiving a payment on time, finding a perfect Seattle gray afternoon where the rain smelled like home, building something new from the wreckage of what had been lost. These weren't the things I'd thought mattered when I'd been obsessively saving and planning for a future I thought I could control, but they mattered now, maybe more than anything else. The Seattle skyline was still visible from certain spots in Tacoma, the Space Needle rising above the buildings, a reminder of where I'd been and what I'd survived. I didn't go back often, but when I did, I'd drive through Capitol Hill and past my old building, marveling at how much had changed and how much I'd changed. That version of me who'd trusted too easily and planned too rigidly seemed like a stranger now. I was harder but also more compassionate, more careful, but also more willing to accept help, more aware of how quickly everything could fall apart, but also how it was possible to rebuild. My best friend had used my savings without permission, and when my father saw me in line at the shelter, he gave me something more valuable than money. He gave me a second chance, a safe place to land, and a relationship I'd thought was broken beyond repair. Sometimes the worst moments in life crack you open in ways that let the light back in, and standing in the ruins of what you thought your life would be, you find the materials to build something stronger, something real, something that can withstand the storms you never saw coming.